Hello, I'm Sandra Penney. I'm the curator of the Canadian Military Engineers Museum. And today I'm going to talk about color theory and why it's important when we're thinking about installing our exhibits and designing them. Color is something that surrounds us all the time, but we tend not to think about it uh, until it becomes a specific need to do so. Usually when we're thinking about it, it's because we're struck with a particular dislike or a particular like, or we're thinking about something like choosing clothing or painting a room. There are many palettes that go into making color. We have additive light colors, which we have on the right here, sorry, the left here. And those are what we normally see when we're talking about video screens or television. That's not what I'm going to be talking about. The printer's palette, or the one in the middle, is used for print. That's what we see coming off of our printers. It's a mix of cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. But what we're going to look at is the subtractive color of the printer's palette. And the basics of that set of colors are red, blue, and yellow. They are the primary colors, and they combine to create secondary colors of purple, green, and orange. And all of the colors that we have when we're talking about color are made up of the three primaries and the addition of white, black, or gray. And those are a world of combinations. So the pigments that we're using, like I said, are red, blue, and yellow, and the black and gray. So the color palette is combined by adding all of these colors that you can see. If you have any two of the primary colors, the secondary colors will be midway between them. And you have to look at all of the variations within them. Our colors are referred to as hues. So when you're doing the hues are very infinite and very subtle when you're moving from one color to another. So when you look at the first half of the wheel, which would be red, orange, and into yellow, down towards yellow, and then red, violet, heading towards the blue, these are warm tones. The other set of tones that come out of the blue would be where violet, blue, and green transition to yellow. So that's what we're referring to as warm and cool when we talk about hues. When you're thinking about how colors relate to each other, there's the primary, the secondary, but then there are also complementaries. And normally a complementary is what would be directly opposite the color you're looking at. So the complementary for red would be green, and for yellow it would be violet. I use a color wheel when I'm thinking about color. If I'm trying to figure out what direction I want to go, I've picked up this particular color wheel at an art supply store. They're easy to find online or in an art supply store. Sometimes even stationers carry them. So when you're looking at this particular one, it's actually three layers. You have the hues along the outside, and then this inner portion moves so that you can see what's going to come out of your color combinations if you were mixing paint. So if you took violet and added white to it, you would get that light mauve. Blue, add yellow, you'll get green. And then on the back, you have another set of tones and shades and tints. Tints are what happen when you add white. Tones are when you get gray, and those are the mid-levels of color. And the shades are going to be what happens when you add varying amounts of black. In general, the warm colors are more aggressive and they seem to advance towards a viewer, while the cooler colors tend to recede and they tend to fade into the background. Yellow and violet can go either warm or cool, depending on if they have more red mixed with them or more blue with them. And the same is what's the case when you're dealing with yellow. You can have very cool yellows, which would have green, or warm yellows, which have red. Now, this is how you look at the color chart in 3 dimensions. As I said, around the edge of the color chart, you have your hues, and the hues are what we think of when we are talking color. But technically, they're the hues. The value of a color, which is the center part of the illustration on the left, is going from adding white to black to a particular color. And conversely, the saturation of the color would be the chroma. And that's the diagram moving left and right. So if you've done your mix of your hues and you've decided how much gray or white to lighten or darken it you're going to make, how much saturation are you going to put into it? And that makes an infinite number of colors. The chart that I have on the right is the Munsell color chart. And that is a spherical or cylindrical model. And the pole at the top is white and the pole at the bottom is black. So as you increase the saturation or the hue, or you move around the hue, you're going to get so many variations in shade that you're not going to be limited by what you first thought of when you look at your palette of just the primaries, black, white, and gray. To really give this an illustration, what you're going to see is how the artifacts interact with your background colors. So I've taken a set of contemporary metals and working on the assumption that I want to place them into an exhibit case. What kind of background am I going to choose? You have to take into consideration what your case color already is, or if you're going to be changing it, what it's going to be. If you look at the top row, I've photographed the same metals using white on the left, black on the right, and then 2 tones of gray in the middle. Black and white are very extreme colors, so they can be very, very dramatic. And in both those cases, the colors really do pop out of their backgrounds. The grays give it a bit more of a soft aspect. If you look at the colors in the middle row, I chose extreme colors here to show some interactions. The green on the left is very, very aggressive, and while it does show off the metals really well, it also competes with the metals. You tend to look more at the green in the background than you are at the metals. The navy background is a little more soothing. Most of the metals stand out very nicely from it. The red is a very common color chosen for exhibiting metals, but sometimes a problem you can run into is that the red competes with the importance of the metals themselves. When there's red in the metal, it seems like it just sort of bleeds into the background and you're not going to really notice it as much. The bottom row here looks at mid-tones. On the left, we have the Melville tartan. The metals do stand out nicely from that, but where there are several colors interplaying around it, again, it's a little bit busy, and you'd probably have been better off to choose one of the main colors of the background of the tartan. In the middle, I have a warm brown. It's a little bit receding, it's a little bit warm, but the metals do stand out nicely from it. And if you have a neutral background case, it's not going to be something that looks like a great big solid block as a blob of color in the middle of your exhibit. And again, if you're going in for lighter background colors, the satiny beige that I used here is very non-aggressive. It shows off the whites nicely, and it doesn't overpower any of the colors in the metals and the ribbons themselves. Here's another set of artifacts on the same sort of backgrounds. These are all booby trap triggers. They don't have the importance that we tend emotionally that we tend to put on metals. So they play a bit differently with the background. When you don't have a lot of emotion going into how you're dealing with your artifact, you can be a bit more clinical. And sometimes it's easier to figure out how your backgrounds are going to interact with your artifacts if you actually have something not quite so emotionally important to you. And again, here, the red tends to compete with the colors of the booby trap triggers. The beiges, they stand out very well on. It's a neutral background, and you really are seeing the objects themselves without any sort of distraction. The blue, they stand out nicely, but again, it's something that's not quite as congruent to what you're looking at. Perhaps a similar tone of, say, a green or a brown might have made that stand out better. But for the black ones, the ones on the black background, you can really see that they pop off of the black. The black is absorbing so much light that really what you're seeing are the artifacts. And I'm not really saying that, you know, all of your artifacts should be displayed on black or white or a beige background, but really think about how things look on these backgrounds. You really want people to be looking at your artifacts, not what they're sitting in. And playing with the color is really a good way of doing that. And here we have just a mix of artifacts on a black background. And their background just disappears. Those of you who were in the Tyrrell Museum when we were in Calgary, that one gallery that was completely black and had the statue of the bones of the dinosaur in the middle standing out like a piece of artwork, I found that to be very, very dramatic. So using really intense tones like black can really, really make something stand out. And this just gives you an idea of the variety of colors and textures that black will play off of. Here we have the same artifacts on red. And again, red is a very aggressive color. Sometimes you do want your backgrounds to be noticeable, but never to compete with your artifacts. Your artifacts are what you want your people to be looking at. And having the visual focus of those colors can really make things pop. One of the problems I see in this set is the metals on the bottom left. that purplish red on the American metal stands out, but it kind of clashes with the red. It's an uncomfortable connection of colors. So in this case, I wouldn't really want to go with a tomatoey red like we have in the background here. But I do like the way that the red makes all of the badges stand out. In both cases of the cap badges and the specialty and command badges, it does stand out well, even though there is some visual competition there. This is a selection of fabrics that I used when I was taking a lot of the photographs for this talk. And because things were photographed, the white balance of the camera sometimes changed from how I was seeing the items in person. So what we have here on the left is a cool gray, black, a cool charcoal, and then below it is a gray that has a very slight greenish tint to it. On the right, I have a warm brown. Running through the middle is a soft beige, and then a slightly darker beige. And you'll see more of these in the next slides. So here I have put the same artifact on several backgrounds. You can see on the left and on the top the collar badges, how the camera perceived what we were looking at changed the color of the badge in the photograph. So with the warm brown, you're seeing the color much closer to what it really is than in the white, where there was so much contrast with the white that the color balance was a bit odd. But then when we went to the softer grayish color, for some reason the camera picked up on the black accents in those pieces. The card in the middle, that's an interesting one because the gray at the top really does show the creaminess of the paper to a much better advantage than it did on the brown and beige tones. You'd think that the complement would make the cream look stronger, but it really didn't. The browns just sort of made the white wash out the tulle on the top. That was one that was very hard to find a good background for, because in and of itself, the artifact was so dark that I really had to have a light color. And the blue, pale greens, those didn't work well. Going with a neutral beige and a neutral brown were much better, where you got enough light contrast that you could see the artifact and it wasn't trying to influence how our eye was seeing the color. When you go back to the metals on the left, the grayish background really shows the creaminess in the metals. The enamel is actually ivory more so than pure white, and the white in the edges of the green ribbon, they show as creamy, but then there's not enough contrast between that background and the artifact itself, so it just seems like the edges of the ribbon fade into nothingness. The brown below it is nicer for showing off the ribbons, but the white tended to look more white than it really was. But that's really not an issue when you have a large group of metals. In person, you can still see the color differential very nicely. The specialist badges, you can see all of them showed off very nicely against both the cool and the warm backgrounds. The color is mid-tone, and you don't have a lot of competition with the other colors that are in those badges. The blue sometimes played better or was less complementary. And then sometimes on the paler beige, I was finding that the gold of the wings tended to just disappear a bit. And again, the medium tones that we used on the badges, they showed up the badges very nicely, but depending on what the predominant color of the badges themselves were, sometimes the grays were more prominent, sometimes the golds were more prominent. The silver of the Highland badge, that one showed off to best advantage actually on dark colors, whereas the Rifle Regiment badge is so dark that it really did need a pale background for it to stand out. So the value of your contrast, in addition to what the actual hue is going to play with how things look. If you say something like, it's a pink background to people, you're going to get a certain emotional response to the idea of pink. But if you make it into a deep salmon color, how people react with it are going to be a bit different. So this is real world application of the colors. On the left is the color palette of the exhibit galleries in the Canadian Military Engineers Museum. The gray that we chose, which is at the top and looks kind of blue in this image, is very cool. And the browns and greens and what looks like yellow are mid-value tones with a little bit of sort of a middle saturation. They're not completely pure colors, but they're not washed out either. The red is very close to the red that's used on flags, particularly the CME camp flag. And we chose that, and you can see it in the illustration to the right, in a transitional zone. That's the exit from our gallery into the hall of the school. And throughout the gallery, if you look up towards the ceiling and towards the door, you can see that red. And we chose that deliberately to assist with our evacuation procedures. We don't use that color anywhere else in backgrounds. It only shows up in the scarlets of uniforms. The small inset on the right are the colors that we had been using from about 2007 to 2016. They're much paler colors, and they didn't really have a lot of impact. As you moved through the gallery, you tended to feel like things were wishy-washy, but it was better than that middle color, which is the original D&D office color that gets put on the walls of pretty much every building that gets built and used by National Defense. So this is gives you an idea of what our colonial exhibit area looks like. We chose that blue because of how it interacted with the large paintings you can see in the upper image. This is the first area that visitors walk through, and it contrasts very nicely with the tools exhibit, which is what's behind me right now. And it provided a nice complement to the paintings. And to give you an idea of how dominant those paintings really are, they're 8 feet tall, and together they span just over 20 feet wide. Next page. This is our second gallery. This is the Great War exhibit. In these pictures, the walls look very yellow, but it's actually khaki that we chose. The lighting in that gallery accentuates that color of yellow. And in our wartime era exhibits, we chose tones that were very similar to the uniforms that were being worn to provide a complement. And a lot of the pieces in the First World War gallery are wood tones. There's the early olive drab. There's a lot of brass, but then you get colors popping out like the gray of the shutter to the right of the two uniforms there. And it also provides a nice contrast to the artwork that we have in that gallery. And you can see a couple of exhibit pieces on the right-hand side there. This is the start of our Second World War gallery. And the color we chose there is more of the olive drab. It's very close in tone to the shirts that the Royal Canadian Engineers were wearing. It's very close in hue to a lot of the artifacts, but it varies from them in both the shade and the saturation. All of the artifacts, with only a few exceptions, are in the green range, and the browns that show up provide a bit of a split from that hard green overbearing color. And then we end up with a few artifacts that are very dark olive, or like you can see on the left, black, or the pale gray of the engine. We went with mid saturations of colors because we didn't want them to overpower or really obscure the artifacts. There's enough of a difference between them. The artifacts still stand out, but they're comfortable. It's not an uneasy pairing of colors on opposite sides of the color spectrum. At the far end of the photo on the right, just near the corner, you can see a bit of the Combat Divers exhibit, which is turquoise. And we went with a really strong contrast there because it stands out from the rest of the gallery as a theme change. And the turquoise was evocative of underwater. We were looking at a lot of photographs of the combat divers training, and their initial training is done in a pool. And it also provided a very nice contrast to the dive suits, which are almost exclusively black. So we have a lot of artwork in our collection. Most of it is exhibited outside of our exhibit galleries. But we also took pains to make sure that how we were showing these artifacts made them look good in pretty drab circumstances. Most of these are hung on that D&D gray wall, which is really pretty wishy-washy, to be honest. So if you look at the top row, the two recruitment posters, those are being exhibited as we received them in these wooden and brown frames. In the first case, the yellow and olive tones of the artwork itself blend nicely with the framing, but there's enough of a green so that they stand out a bit from the more warm tones of the brown. But when you look at Soldiers in a Common Cause, that one in the same frame is just sort of blah. The red doesn't do anything really much with the colors. It's very close to the browns, but there's no real pop. And I think if I had the chance to reframe that at some point, I'd want to look more at what other colors, because where it is exhibited, I don't have the option of coloring the walls. Next to them is a Sylvia Pacoda photograph that I'm sure a lot of you have seen already. And it's part of a triptych. So there are 3 images in the same frame, and they all have that intense blue predominant with just a single aspect of red. So we framed them with a blue mat and a blue frame to allow that red to stand out. When we looked at other pieces of Sylvia Pagoda's work, we found how she played with the color contrasts was very impressive. And we didn't want to detract from that. So we took a blue tone from the images and just spread that into the framing. The 3 portraits below are part of a set. And we were looking at those ones really to just enhance what was the picture. And it's a fairly significant collection in tones of olive and browns with red, except there's that one portrait, which is on the left, where someone's wearing patrol dress, and the background is that turquoisey type blue. So we went with gold frames, and that helped to unite the fact that these were actually a set, and they do stand out very nicely from the pale gray of the hallways. The other 3 images on the right, in all of those cases, we chose the matte tone from a color in the image. And we did that so that there wouldn't be too much contrast in the colors. And they came across as more restful. The images didn't tend to fight with the backgrounds they had been on before. And again, that very lackluster gray hallway color. The 2 with the green are part of a larger set of watercolors. And uniting them with the same matte color really emphasized that they belong to the same location and the same time period. Throughout the school, we have some jewel case cabinets that allow us to provide visual storage for some of our collection. And in a lot of these cases, we chose very strong and sometimes surprising colors. As I said before, these hallways don't have a lot of color in them. So by painting the backgrounds of the jewel case into a really saturated hue, we really drew the collection to the eye. What we found was that people were stopping because all of a sudden there was this just blast of something different that caught their attention. And it was making them ask, well, why are these things here? Where can I see more of it? And it really added to drawing people into the museum as they're moving through the school. The china cabinet on the right, most of the china is white with fine blue lines, and we went with the red so that we wouldn't compete with the blue. We really wanted the china and the silver to stand out from the cabinet background, and we think that worked fairly well. When you're dealing with colors, your choice really is not limited by what you want to do just from the point of your collection. Sometimes we tend to be very conservative and choose neutrals that don't really have a lot of impression. And when we want to make a statement, we tend to look at really patriotic choices. A lot of times, especially when you're walking down the halls of a mess in a regiment, you'll see the colors of the regiment being used as backgrounds. That can be very effective. But again, if what you're exhibiting sort of blends into it or is overpowered by it, you're not really serving your exhibit well. There aren't really right or wrong choices when you're looking at it, why you choose a color. Just be aware that what you want people to pay attention to. Do you want them to look at what's on exhibit, or do you want them to look at where they're being exhibited? We found that the color of the galleries can have a real impact on how the artifacts are looked at, because if the artifacts are what has the foremost presence, they're judged to be more important. And the color of the gallery will really evoke emotional responses. You can play with color to create a sense of unease. Depending on how closed your area is, choosing colors that people don't really expect can sometimes make them uneasy, which can play into themes that you might want to be looking at there. Now, these are other areas of our school. What we have are the lounges, and on the right is the lower common room, or the all ranks canteen. When the walls were first chosen to be painted that institutional green, there was a lot of pushback from the visitors. They found it very overwhelming. And if you remember going into government offices in the 70s or into hospitals, that was a really predominant color, and it does make people uneasy. But once there were essentially decorator pieces added, where a number of places have been painted red and blue, like that flag behind the label on the wall, it made the green less overpowering. We were able to bring artifacts into the area to talk about what the engineers are doing. And it really made the space much more comfortable, having those very, very strong colors selectively in what had been a fairly uncomfortable space without them. The lower area is the staff lounge, and the walls in there are a medium beige color, sort of a taupey aspect to it. So there's a little bit of a gray into that. And it provides a really nice neutral and calm background. A lot of staff have their lunch there. It's also a place where we socialize for certain unit events and things. As you can see, the tracks have been converted into a bar, and then they've added more patriotic colors in the camp flags. The frieze of the plaques stands out nicely. Most of those don't have a lot of color in them. They tend to be bronzes and browns, but you can see them very nicely in that space, and it's actually quite restful. So as I was putting this together, one of the resources that I use a lot is this particular book, The Artist's Little Book of Color. And it's one I just picked up at random in a bookstore. And there are a lot of resources out there when you're starting to think about color. I like this one because as you flip through it, you can see how they talk about color. They're talking specifically about paint pigments in these, but then just seeing the variety of hues within those pigments really gets you thinking about how do you really want to engage in how you're thinking about color. And it can make it a lot easier to narrow down what colors you are ultimately going to choose. to go into an area that you're going to change the color on can be very intimidating. You know what your artifacts are going to be, what their colors are. Sometimes going with safe colors can be perfectly good, but also look at colors that you might not think of as being safe. And the best way to do that is this way. This is my color palette box. It weighs about 6 kilograms. And these are all paint chips that I've collected just over the years of doing different projects. And a really great way to develop a color palette or to think about what options are actually out there when you're looking to look at background colors is just go to the hardware store. It's there. You can pick up these little chips that cost you nothing. You have no idea how many shades of white there actually are until you start looking at the color palettes. So really, don't limit yourself. Really take the time to do a little bit of looking at what color theory is, how you can use it, and where you want to go with it. You know, sometimes going with UN blue or Air Force blue or Navy blue is exactly what you need. But maybe you need to veer off slightly, make your blue a little warmer, make it a little cooler, and you can see what that will do by picking up these color chips and looking at them under the lighting that you're going to have in your gallery. So don't be afraid to look at color, to really look at the variety of colors that you can work with. And sometimes going outside of your initial assumption to look at complementary colors or contrasting colors can really add a dynamic aspect to what you're trying to do. And here are some of the resources that I've been using. So most of these are internet resources, and they're readily available. All you have to do is type in color theory or hue or value, and you're going to get so many hits. I actually spent days putting together what I was going to pull into this collection. At the bottom, the color checker source, there is a very good glossary of color there. And color checker is that little device that you sometimes see in the corner of a photograph of an artifact that has all of the different colors in it to make sure that your color rendering when you're taking a photograph is correct. That site also has a very good interactive color test based on the Munsell color sphere. And if you ever want to find out how good you really are at figuring out colors, take that test. It only takes a few minutes, and it's really surprising when you think about what's going on with color. So thank you very much. I will have this made available to the OMMC with my speaking notes included. And if you have any questions, I will be at the live session on Wednesday evening. So thank you very much.